Hey, welcome everybody. Andrew Holecek here for another Edge of Mind podcast. And boy, I have fun doing these things, but rarely do I have so much fun, or I know I'm going to have as much fun as I'm going to have today with two dear friends who are extraordinary scholars, academics, professors. Very, very delighted, very excited to talk about a topic that I'm super interested in these days in dark retreat. So David Germano is professor of Tibetan and Buddhist studies at the University of Virginia, where he directs the Tibet Center and the Generative Contemplation Initiative. His personal scholarship is focused on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, with a particular focus on the Great Perfection or Dzogchen tradition. He has trained many doctoral students in Tibetan Buddhism, with students currently professors now at Northwestern, University of Toronto, Stanford, Davidson College, Florida State University, Naropa, University Case Western Reserve, and many other institutions of higher education. And along with Michael, these biographies are so rich and extensive, I'm going to leave the rest of it for the formal write-up, which you'll get with this podcast. Michael Sheehy is a meditation and researcher and scholar of Tibetan Buddhism. He is a research assistant professor and director of research at the Contemplative Sciences Center at the University of Virginia. He is the founding director of CIRCL, I guess that's close to circle, Contemplative Innovation plus Research Co-Lab, and is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contemplative Studies. Michael studies how meditation works, how the generative, dynamic, and ever-evolving process of contemplative practices enhance our experience of being human. He studied extensively in Tibet, including several years training in a Buddhist monastery and 12 years conducting field work to preserve rare manuscripts on the plateau. Over the past decade, he has collaborated with scientists on interdisciplinary research projects to understand the operations of contemplative practices. So thank you, dear friends, for taking time out of your busy lives and schedules to hang with me. It just means a lot to me to spend some time with you on a topic that's just front and center in my life these days. So thank you so much in advance.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here. Dreams and darkness.
Dreams and darkness, yeah. So let's just jump right into this. Dark retreat. Boy, it's been an ancient practice in a number of wisdom traditions, arguably reaching its fruition in the schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And boy, is it making a comeback. So maybe we can start with a little bit of a history, contextualization of dark practice, how it fits in historically, and then transition into its applicability in this modern age. And so, David, if you feel like leading us off, jump right in, my friend.
Sure. So I'll answer that in my lane, which is Tibetan Buddhism, which is what I know best about. And I have spent the last number of years, maybe 6 or 7 years, really focused on dark retreats in Tibet, and so I've thought a lot about them. And in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, there's really two great streams in terms of doing sustained contemplative retreats in the context of pitch black darkness. And we don't exactly know the context for it. We can speculate about how these two great streams are related, but I don't think there's any clarity about that. And the actual background before the 11th century is quite unclear. But from the 11th century forwards, we have two great streams. One stream is the Kalachakra, the Wheel of Time, which gets translated quite quickly from India into Tibetan. And it gets taken up by a variety of Tibetan traditions, particularly the Jonam tradition, which Michael does a lot of work with, but also in the Geluk tradition, Sakya tradition, and really any tradition, Kagyu, that uses the Kalachakra. The other stream of dark retreats is really in the context of Dzogchen, or the Great Perfection tradition, which exists both in the Nyingma and in the Bumpo schools primarily, but you also find prominent adherents or practitioners of it in the Kagyu tradition, in various types, and other traditions as well. But so primarily, the Nyingma and the Bumpo, though, represent two quite distinct versions of the dark retreat. And so the context of the dark retreat in Tibetan Buddhism is really in those two different traditions, one grounded in the Kalachakra, which is relatively homogeneous, compared to Dzogchen, which is a very diverse umbrella for a variety of different traditions that often are quite different from each other. And so what you find in Dzogchen, which I'm more familiar with, Michael having more expertise in the context of the Kalachakra, is the word dark retreat does not correspond to any particular kind of meditation. What people do in the darkness under the umbrella of the Dzogchen tradition is wildly varied in character. And that's what's really interesting about this, namely that when people go into darkness, what do they do and why do they do it? And as I've gotten deeper and deeper into this subject matter over the last number of years, I've just often been surprised by, oh, wow, I had no idea that's what they did. But then I'll read another kind of tradition and it'll be very different in character. So maybe that's just a kind of initial introduction to the context, and I can switch it over to Michael, who can talk more about the Kalachakra and Jonang tradition.
Perfect.
Great. Thanks, David. And thank you for having us, Andrew. Such a pleasure. So, yeah, we've done some sort of preliminary kind of foray into dark retreat more globally, and then I'll focus more on the Kalachakra practice, as David alluded to. So we have some sense that going into the dark for intentional transformation is a practice that humans have been practicing for thousands of years. Some of the earliest recorded content that we have, or evidence, not necessarily recorded, but more archaeological, is around from the traditions of Parmenides in Greece, so kind of pre-Socratic traditions about 5th century BC. And we have tradition there of people going into what they call wombs or incubatory worlds in the ground. And these are caves or hollows underground. And as time goes on, they start to build temples on top of these caves or underground hollows. And there's a sort of worship of gods, in particular the sun god, that happens in these temples, but then pathways to these underworld spaces that are again used, and they use the word of incubate, the language of incubation. That is to say, going into like a womb to sort of regenerate, reform, and rebirth oneself. We find that early Christianity, particularly the Desert Fathers, have these practices out in the desert and probably northern Africa, also of darkness for extended periods of time, and that this gets sort of developed in the mystical traditions. Christianity, we have similar analogs in Taoism from early periods, alchemical teachings that are associated with being in spaces of light deprivation and enclosures where people go in to meditate for extended periods of time. And then in the Tibetan traditions, really borrowed or sort of inherited from India, the Kalachakra, as David mentioned, becomes within the Tantric tradition really the first that we're aware of at the moment. We're always learning more, but probably, and there's definitely dialogue as far as we can tell with the early Dzogchen traditions that start to take shape around the 11th century. But with the Kalachakra, which begins early, mid 11th century, we have a clear indication that people are going in to practice the yogas, which I'll talk about, of the Kalachakra, beginning in dark and oscillating between what they call daytime and nighttime practices, which are euphemisms for the dark and the light, right? Exposure and deprivation. So there's a constant oscillation between exposure and deprivation. David can talk, we see similar parallels in the Dzogchen tradition. The Kalachakra, there's the Tantra, then there's this extensive commentary, and then there's a whole Tibetan tradition of extensive instructions that happened over the next millennium. And we see in the root Tantra and the Vimalaprabha, the stainless light commentary, this extensive Indian Sanskrit source on the Kalachakra, that they're talking about going into the dark to practice and what they say spaces without cover. In other words, open sky. And they start to describe cloudless skies and so on and so forth. So they borrow this from a passage in the Prajna Paramita literature in 8,000 lines, this transcendent wisdom literature that's extensive in late Mahayana Buddhism in India. And this passage then catches on and becomes sort of a core phrase or citation within the Kalachakra, and then they extend that out. based, as far as we know, on practices that, well, we don't know to what extent they existed and to what extent they were developed. But within the Kalachakra, we see this material being recorded. And then by the time it gets to Tibet, as David mentioned, there's different streams of the Kalachakra, and there's two main streams. There's what we call the Ra tradition and the Dro tradition. And those are named, those streams, lineages, if you will, are named after the people who translated the Kalachakra from Indic sources, from the Sanskrit language into the Tibetan language. There were actually multiple translations of the Kalachakra, several others, in fact. However, those two became the predominant, the reception of the Kalachakra were of those two translations. And there was, I can get into the history, but basically there was 16 transmissions, but they became consolidated into these two by the 12th century and then reconsolidated in the 14th century. But nonetheless, these sort of, to keep it simple, became the Dro tradition stream becomes synonymous with the Jonang, and the Ra tradition becomes synonymous with, in the early days, that is up to the 15th century, with a tradition called the Bodong. So Bodong Chokle Namgyal was one of the great Kalachakra scholars in Bodong Monastery. It's a very small kind of tradition of its own. And then that was subsumed by the Gelug tradition by the time of Tsongkhapa, and Gelug scholasticism sort of subsumes that by the let's say mid 15th century, by the 15th century, let's say. And so I'll pause there just to sort of paint the picture of these two. And I will just say the key distinction is that the Jonang tradition, which is, what I'm, the tradition I'm familiar with, is the tradition that has maintained these practices as living practices that they, put a lot of effort and intent in preserving.
I mean, this is just fantastic, because otherwise people can think, are we just pulling a rabbit out of the hat, or in this case, a rabbit out of the dark? And so the traditional exposition, not only in Tibetan Buddhism, but in the other schools, so critically helpful here. So a couple of immediate questions. These traditions, as you very well know, the dark practices are traditionally kept secretive. They're referred to as, my language, prescription strength meditations. Why are you comfortable? Why do you feel comfortable talking to me about these practices that were previously hard to play but kept in the dark? So the role of secrecy in the modern world, to what extent that should be paid homage to, and then I'll talk a little bit later about the applications in this modern world. But let's start with the whole notion of secrecy. So I'm curious, David, maybe with you, how do you relate to that? The fact we're bringing this stuff out into the public domain.
Well, I think one of the first questions to ask yourself is, why are they secret? Like, what's the function of secrecy historically around these practices and other related practices? And there's a variety of ways to think about that before we get into the issues of modern times and people who are not Tibetan, such as Michael's not Tibetan, I'm not Tibetan, talking about these things and how we need to navigate these issues of secrecy, which I think are very complicated. And, one way to think about secrecy is maintaining the element of surprise, or like not allowing people to get a conceptual map of what's going to happen, what I'm going to do, what I should expect to happen, and so forth, and rather have them put into an environment where things are unexpected and they're navigating them in a more dynamic way. So, for example, recently I was organizing a workshop in California, and several times asked the person who was very generously hosting it, could you send me photos? And he was like, he didn't send me photos. And I kept forgetting that he told me there was a reason why he wasn't sending me photos, because they wanted people to be surprised. They wanted people to come to the land without a cognitive map or a visual impression of it and really encounter it in that way. So I think that's one function of secrecy, particularly with regards to darkness and some of the particular contemplative traditions that Tibetans articulated for working within darkness, namely wanting people to deal with it in a kind of self-emergent, dynamic fashion, instead of just having it all conceptually mapped out and then going through this kind of program of activity. A second reason, I think, that is, of course, traditionally always cited, but I think it's an authentic reason, which is danger to people who become potentially, through this practice or some other practices, either cognitively unhinged because they're not really prepared for it, but because they read about it and they think, oh, I've got the instructions now, and so I'm going to go off and do it myself, and they do damage to themselves. or they don't do damage to themselves, they do damage to others because they get inflated and egotistical and narcissistic, and they think, oh, now I've done this, and they go out and do all sorts of damaging things to other people with a kind of delusion about what they've accomplished and what they've realized. And I think partly that boils down to our delusion about what meditative practice is. We often think that in this era of so-called universal literacy and self-help books and so forth, we think meditation can be boiled down to a set of procedural instructions that we can simply read and inhabit and execute. And I think that's just profoundly wrong. It's never been a set of procedural instructions. That's one aspect of what meditation is. The other aspects of meditation, beyond the procedural instructions, like, sure, we could take any particular meditative practice and we could exhaustively write out, like, do this first, do this second. Here's a picture of the posture to do. Here's how you change your gaze. Here's a diagram with visualizations and all these other kind of steps. But that's not going to tell you how to deal with the experiences that these methods trigger and elicit and how to work with those, because those are profoundly irregular in character. They're unpredictable in their nature and the extent and intensity and duration and so forth. And that's where you really want to have access to a teacher who has a deep experience with these practices, who can be responsive to what is happening to you and help you guide your way through that landscape of experience. And so in addition to the kind of oral embodied instructions you might get, I think that presence of a teacher and their capacity to respond to the emergent elicited experiences, which increasingly become the dynamic, become the core thing that's happening in your meditation. The methods begin to drop away and the experience becomes crucial. And then the other part, that this illusion of thinking meditation can be articulated in procedural instructions written down in a manual, is the world in which these people live, whether they're Tibetans or the Greeks that Michael was talking about, or Mayans in Guatemala, or whoever they might be. They come to these practices, like we all come to these practices, whatever those practices are, whether they're meditation or something else, they come with a distinctive life world and an environmental world in which they live. And this profoundly shapes the nature of the practice. So when particular words and images and experiences come to the fore, they're shaped by the culture, by the community, by the language, by the embodied experiences that these people have lived throughout their lives, including the detailed study of a particular tradition with its philosophy, its cosmology, its traditions of space and time and so forth. And these profoundly shape it. So when you just grab the procedural instructions and you think that somehow you're clued in now to the practice, it's really a profound delusion, and it's never going to work for you. So, or if it does work for you, it's going to go in ways that are very unexpected and potentially not helpful. So those are all the reasons why I think secrecy as preventing danger is an authentic way to talk about these kinds of things. So, and there's other ways, of course, to talk about traditional secrecy as well. But I think it's really important to ask that question, why are they a secret? And not just think, well, and there's also authentic reasons that I would be critical of. People kept things secret because they often treated them like possessions, like commodities. And they wanted to control those commodities because it's how they made their income. It's how they created support, not just for themselves necessarily, but for their lineages. Maybe it's a biological lineage, if it's a tantric family where spiritual charisma is transmitted biologically from parent to offspring and so forth. Maybe it's to preserve the commodity commodity is not the right word, but preserve the tradition for their own tradition, their own monastery or monastic communities and so forth. So that's not necessarily something to criticize. We all have to sustain ourselves, but sometimes that can be something to criticize when it seems like people are just really concerned about keeping the boundaries of secrecy and access to these traditions for reasons that maybe are less than positive. So there are these other negative aspects of thinking about secrecy traditionally that one could potentially be critical of. Anyways, those are some thoughts about secrecy from a traditional point of view. I think when people like us, all three of us, none of whom have an ounce of Tibetan blood in us, regardless of whatever delusions we might have about our, spiritual DNA or some kind of past life pedigree, we're not Tibetans. As people in my house, because I have a Tibetan wife and I have a half Tibetan child who both constantly remind me, you're not Tibetan, you're American. As my son said today in the car, he said, "You speak English, Daddy, not Tibetan." So, In fact, I speak Tibetan, but that's not what he thinks. So for us, I think it's really deeply problematic because Tibetans are a people who are under a lot of pressures over the last 60 or 70 years because of political events. And these traditions have suffered tremendously over the past 70 years. And so when we talk about their systems of thought, their contemplative practices, as people who are outside of that, biologically, regardless of how many years we spent living and studying with them, I think it's fraught with danger and fraught with peril. And so because there's colonialization issues, I think, that are going on there. And so I could talk about my own thoughts, but I don't have like an ambivalent perspective on that issue.
Yeah, fantastic, David. Before I turn to Michael, because this is such a key central topic, I definitely want Michael's response to it as well. But just a couple of small things. Part of my aspiration in bringing you on board, and we'll get a little bit more specific about this in terms of the modern kind of popular phase of this practice taking place. Part of my aspiration in bringing you on is to actually keep as many people out as I might invite in, because the danger of spiritual materialism, the danger of elitism, exceptionalism, all kinds of traps are there. So I think that's important to state at the outset. And also, what a delightful thing for you to say in terms of secrecy as the element of surprise. I remember when I did my 3-year retreat, we were about to go into 3 months of Mahamudra, and we were exhorted, almost demanded, do not study, do not prepare, just jump into the texts and read them with a beginner's mind. And that to me is look at all the books I had behind me. I was like, what? I'm supposed to be prepared. So I think that's also really helpful to know. And then along those lines, this statement from Mingyur Rinpoche when he was doing his 4-year walkabout meditation. It's really stuck with me, where he said, I wanted to put myself in situations where I was unfamiliar to myself. I thought that was a really amazing statement. And so now that completely ties into what you were talking about here. But Michael, because the topic this is a big deal topic, because it's so important. Any comments or additions to what David just shared with us?
It's a very big deal topic, and I appreciate you raising it from the get-go here. And I, completely resonate with everything David said, and he and I have talked about this at length, actually. And there are issues of, colonialism. There's issues of Orientalism that we're stepping into, and it is just profoundly fraught. And there's also, the traditional reasons for secrecy, as David articulated. To just enunciate some things, I think that, the element of surprise runs very deep, and that it's not, always so obvious. That is to say, the expectations can be non-obvious in our human consciousness. That is to say, our processes of cognition and perception and sensation, where more and more understanding, are very much based on predictive modes and trying to understand what's out there and what the world is made of and how we interpret it through those sensorial, perceptual, cognitive processes. So expectation as an element of interpretation of the world runs deep into our neurovisceral systems, into who we are as human beings. And when we take away the sensory stimuli, when we take ourselves out of the world of habitual familiarization, a world of light, a world of sounds, a world perfumed with smells and odors, a world that's the tactile sensations are deeply enriched as we move through it. And we deprive ourselves intentionally of that, as we do in dark retreat. The element of surprise is profoundly deprived. It's not just that we are not working with the same conceptual maps, which is very much the case, but we're also not working with the same perceptual sensorial maps. And again, in order to put yourself in a situation where those are the conditions, you can easily construct all kinds of ideas and expectations, etc., about what that is, that when you get in there will only be anxiety invoking, will only create situations of stress for yourself. And it's sort of a way to take things like the overstimulation of the ordinary sensorial world and replicate them in, the conditions that are exactly designed to be deprived of them. So I just want to relate this a little bit to dark retreat in those parallels. On that, I think that when we talk about dark retreats or dark retreat practices, again, as a kind of genre of sorts, a kind of variation of different practices that you perform in the dark, they fall into one particular category or camp. I want to outline, when I think of contemplative practices within at least the Tibetan milieu, they're outlined as twofold. One are practices that you cultivate intentionally with effort, cognitive effort, attentional effort, but also, embodied somatic effort, etc. They're very intentional cultivation of skill sets and competencies that you develop over time. That's category A of contemplation. Category B is not so much about cultivation through intentional, effortful practices or techniques. Instead, it presumes you have some competency or literacy and fluency in that. But what it's really about is setting conditions. It's about curating a kind of human experience that's very particular through boundary setting of environments, through the social context, through the objects you encounter in that space, whether it be the sounds, the sights, the smells, etc. So this is, when we talk about dark retreats, we're talking about very controlled environments, condition setting practices that are designed to induce specific context for emergence, for experiences to come about and express themselves on their own. And again, if there's a kind of conceptual framework about what those are, how they should be, under what conditions they should be, it does nothing but continually inhibit and add stress to the human experience, which is exactly the opposite of intent of these kinds of condition setting practices. So I'll pause there, and then maybe I could talk just about my personal motivation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we can go right into that because, this is just fantastic because in a second, we're going to transition into non-traditional engagements of this practice, some of the things that's happening, which is actually what's inspiring me to talk to you guys, to put up perhaps some maybe guardrails may be somewhat presumptuous, but at least some parameters for safe negotiation of a practice that has so much promise, but also correlative peril, that if it isn't harnessed properly, understood properly, it can become highly problematic. So I'm also reminded of something Kalachakra Rinpoche said, spot on here. Expectation is premeditated disappointment. So if you come in with too much of this baggage, again, reinstating what David was talking about, and also what you were saying, Michael, it can completely backfire, because then you're actually loading on to the darkness that which the darkness is designed to actually subtract. So I think that's important. But before we transition into more non-traditional, modern applications and engagements to this practice, maybe you can finish off what you were suggesting you wanted to say. Personal reason.
Well, your question about why strikes, a deep resonance personally.
Why now, just to remind people, right?
Pardon?
Why the secrecy? When you say why, is that what you're referring to?
Why would I personally be involved in this kind of conversation, given who I am? And, I think that I've given this a lot of thought. It's because I feel and have felt, in fact, my primary motivation since I started to counter these traditions as a teenager was a felt sense of their being endangered. And as I sort of grew into them and they became more a part of who I am, I became more affectionate towards how incredible these living traditions of human transformation are, and how precious they are. And I'm at a moment in time here, living in a kind of global world, where these traditions that were very much kept in secrecy, but what that really meant was that they were passed in a very controlled manner, over time in particular contexts with particular student-teacher situations that were, well curated. And we're living now where you can put in YouTube or Google or Facebook your favorite esoteric term from these traditions, whether it be dark retreat or otherwise, and you will get a whole litany of responses that most of which not that I Google these terms too often, but a kind of cursory glance suggests that they're not all well steeped in the traditions themselves, nor are they well contextualized. And I think we're at a moment now where, people like David, myself, yourself as well, Andrew, we also, I think, have a certain advantage, if not responsibility, as people from outside the traditions who've been steeped in them, who have a sort of cultural competency and fluency in our own cultures. Language, as David rightly pointed out, is English, as his son reminds him. And, being alive at this moment of time in a kind of global culture and being fluent in how to navigate that. What are the sensibilities of being in America at this moment, or in participating in a more broader internet culture, for instance? Those are the kind of things that we are more familiar with, that we can articulate in different ways. And just to conclude, one of my primary motivations with doing this, because I spent the first sort of half of my career after graduate school, the first 12 years, doing fieldwork in Tibet, preserving rare manuscripts, right? I was digitally preserving Tibetan texts that we thought were going to not survive. And David's also done a lot of preservation work on the plateau. So coming out of this motivation, again, of preservation, doing this kind of physical preservation of the knowledge traditions, of the textual traditions, I've turned in the last decade or so now to really say, well, let's look at the living traditions, and particularly the practices, the contemplative practices of these traditions. How are they understood? How are they contextualized? How are they transmitted? How are they experienced? Those are the questions that drive my research and that motivate me every day to continue to work with these in this capacity and on such subjects. Because I think we're at a moment where there is a need for not just the translation of the words from the text in Tibetan to text in English, but a kind of broader cultural translation. We need to talk in terms of sort of modalities, lexicons, and motifs, I think even aesthetics that resonate with people alive today. And that also requires another layer of information about things such as cultural psychology and cognitive sciences and contemporary philosophy of mind and so on and so forth. That is to say, discourses alive at our moment in time, and how do they make sense in conversation with, in dialogue with these traditions. So I see that as a kind of gesture towards preserving on a different register.
This is just so rich, so many wonderful, rich topics here. I mean, I just want to put an exclamation point on a couple and then turn it back to David for a comment, question. This notion of, without again being presumptuous, the stewards of integrity and the power of tradition. That really, this is the dark age. It's not hyperbolic to say that these traditions really are at risk of going extinct. And so the issue of maintaining the integrity of these practices, the lineages of transmission, the power of tradition, but at the same time, you are completely aligned with where I was going to go, the extraordinary importance of cultural translation and preservation versus adaptation. In other words, modernization, if we can even say that, if things don't adapt, they go extinct. And so these practices are at risk of going extinct, but the near enemy of adaptation is this type of editing, dilution of the tradition, of the integrity. So this is a really prescient set of statements and a direction where we can now explore this: preservation versus adaptation, evolution of dark retreat, bringing it in these non-traditional ways into the Western world. Do these technologies and practices have a place in the Western world in a non-traditional context? In other words, not going in just for the 49-day traditional Bardo retreat, for example, but going in for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days to simply see how the mind manifests in intense sensory deprivation. So, David, I know I just threw a lot up there, but I'm curious how some of that lands with you, because I think this is perhaps the crux of our conversation today and what we're doing here.
So maybe I can address that. So you said you wanted to then segue to more modern issues. So just by following up on the issue of secrecy, because I focused on the reasons to maintain secrecy, but just to talk briefly about what's problematic about secrecy in this particular context, which Michael referred to, and then talk a little bit about, because I never really said much about the practices themselves, so I just want to briefly talk about that traditional dark retreat context in the tradition of the Nyingma in particular, and then come back to these issues, which segue into the modern. So why know more? Well, Tibetans always knew more. It's not like Tibetans were just surprised. Oh my God, what's that practice? What's this practice? I mean, they knew so much before the practice, during the practice, and after the practice than anybody in a English-speaking modern context could possibly know. And so if we limit the production of knowledge about these traditions, whether through translation or analysis or interpretation or creative kind of acts, only to a limited few who work within a very specific context in the lineage and so forth, then there's just going to be a paucity of resources available to people. Not to insult those limited few, but they're limited. They're always limited. Everybody who's a limited few are going to be limited in character, limited in perspective, limited in capacity, limited in orientation. So, whereas in Tibet, you had an entire culture mobilized, people who were creative, people who were analytical, people who were conservative, people who were innovative, working on these and producing knowledge about them, which other Tibetans could then consume that knowledge and benefit from it, and benefit from hundreds of years of people with different kinds of experiences while meditating, different kinds of reflections about what those meditations meant, or what shape they might take, or how to understand them, and so forth. So I think that's an argument for us to say, this is not working. The bifurcation of people who are just academics and people who are in Dharma centers and so forth, it is not working to produce the kind of rich, nuanced, sophisticated knowledge that we need people who are interested in these practices in a traditional context seriously. And so we have to overcome this if we have any hope of kind of some semblance of continuation of the extraordinary richness and profundity of the Tibetan tradition itself. So that's a motivator to think about how can we produce an environment where we preserve what should be preserved, but people also have access to the knowledge beyond just what one teacher can give them, because Tibetans had that knowledge. Like there's centuries of people's experience embodied in the textual tradition. And if we don't make that available to people, then they only have a thin sliver of what was available to Tibetans historically who practice these traditions. So that's the first one.
Beautiful.
Second thing, just to kind of backtrack to the Nyingma tradition, as Michael talked about a dichotomy of practices, the way that's framed in the Nyingma tradition is they talk about it as practices which are for people who are focused on reference points or conceptual reference points or schemas, versus practices that involve the self-manifestation or self-presencing of awareness itself. And so these practices in the dark retreat firmly fall under the category of practices which are about the self-presencing of awareness, or Rigpa Randang. And they're also practices that focus more on the so-called effortlessness side of meditative practice and less on the effortful side of practice. Now, one way to think about that is that these practices that focus on the effortless side and on the self-presencing of awareness are practices that focus on self-emergent experiences, which essentially are all experiences. Experiences are self-emergent by definition. You don't map out your day by saying, I'll have this experience at 3 p.m., that experience at 4 p.m. You can map out what method you're going to do, what practice you're going to do. I'm going to ride the bike here. I'm going to sit in a lotus posture at 5 p.m. You can map out all of that stuff because they're deliberate, intentional, they're reference points kind of activities. You set a reference, you deliberately, intentionally intend to pursue it. But when we're talking about experiences of loneliness, of nostalgia, of depression, of joy, of exhilaration, of bliss, of non-conceptuality, whether they're in a meditative context or just in the context of your life, these are always self-emergent. They're unpredictable. They're unpredictable as to when they will happen, what will happen, the intensity of what will happen. So these meditations that we're talking about that are called in the Great Perfection tradition, the self-emergence of awareness or the self-presencing nature of awareness are practices where you lean in to those experiences. The methods are primarily situated to elicit those experiences and then minimize the intrusion of methods and deliberate activities and the exertion of the practitioner's own agency and intentionality, and to let these experiences come to the fore and to just use methods to orient yourself and to somewhat shape these experiences. And so the paradigmatic way this emerged in the 11th century is a very famous practice in the great tradition that's called tugel, a word that is known from previous sources. It means basically to skip over steps in meditation, not to do meditation stage by stage by stage according to a deliberate plan, but to skip over steps. People have called it crossing over, leaping over. I translate it as direct transcendence. The word etymologically means tu means the crest of a mountain, and gel means to pass beyond it, not going like this, but just going right over. So these practices traditionally involve a variety of contexts that elicit spontaneous visions of light. And these contexts can be gazing at an open sky, they can be gazing at a sun, they can never gaze at a sun, that's a warning, but gazing off to the side of the sun, gazing at moonlight, gazing at dappled shadows, gazing at lamplight, and gazing in pitch black darkness. These are all contexts to do these practices. And early on, the focus was on sky gazing or sun gazing, and darkness was seen as simply a kind of ancillary project. It was called an enhancing practice or boktur. And one of the things that happened over time is that certain traditions, and the most famous is called the Yangti Napo, which literally means the black quintessence. They flipped the equation. They flipped the script. They said, what's the paradigmatic practice is going into darkness. If you want to work with the self-presencing of awareness, if you want to work with these luminous visions of your own interior divinity, this Buddha nature that exists within your heart and your brain and elsewhere in your body, then darkness is the paradigmatic way to do it. And it's staring at the sky or staring at the sun. That's the enhancement. That's the supplementary practice. So they flipped the script and did a series of other meditative innovations, which I won't go into today. But just to wrap up that thought about the more specific forms these meditations take, some of the interesting variables here are location. You can do it in a cave. You can do it in a specially prepared house. There's a whole set of architectural recipes for how you construct these houses that you then reside within. Or it can be blindfolds. You can do it just with a blindfold in a sun-filled room. So these are three different location contexts. Another variable, which I haven't seen in the Tibetan tradition, is being static or mobile. As far as I know, these practices are typically done in a kind of static form. I mean, static, physically static. Whereas there are some practices across the world that involve movement. You're moving through cave systems or other things. You're moving through the darkness, which I find really interesting. And I'd love to know if there's any examples of that in the Tibetan context. But in the Tibetan context, I think the biggest divide of all in these different forms of dark retreat meditation is the extent that you apply traditional methods of meditation. There's a number of forms, and this is dominant in early Dzogchen practice, where method is highly attenuated in character. You don't go into the dark retreat and do all these subtle body meditations and visualizations and breathing and all these kinds of things. But typically the focus is more on just waiting and waiting for the visions to come.
Yep.
However, there are all sorts of other practices within Bumbo Dzogchen and Nyingma Dzogchen that have extensive use of methodologies that are consonant with a variety of other meditative practices in these traditions. You visualize the subtle body with its wheels and the heart and throat and skull. You do different kinds of breathing practices. You do vase breathing in your abdominal region. You do different kinds of visualizations with your breath. There's all sorts of things you're doing in the darkness. And one of the really interesting things is, how does that change, or how does that relate to the nature of the visionary manifestations that eventually come? So that issue about the extent to which you use traditional contemplative methods in the dark retreat and the extent to which those methods are highly attenuated is one of the big dividing points. And the last thing I'll say about that is really the most innovative form of darkness meditation in the history of Dzogchen is without a doubt the Yanti Nakpo tradition, which emerges perhaps in the 14th century and still exists today, practiced in America, practiced in Tibet. And it really represents a fundamental innovation that's highly interesting. I think it's the most interesting of Dzogchen dark retreat practices. So then the final thing, which will segue back, and I'll just briefly say this because this segues into, I know where you want us to talk about now, which has to do with how do we proceed from here, or how do these traditions relate to what people might be interested in doing in today's settings, which Michael was discussing in very articulate form. And the way that I'm thinking about it represents this initiative that I've been involved with getting started off the ground over the past 9 months called the Generative Contemplation Initiative. And the Generative Contemplation Initiative, on the one hand, is really exploring in depth these traditional Tibetan practices and trying to help people understand their generative character, namely not like, here's the procedural manual for how you do it, but rather, how are these practices created in the first place? How are they generated out of a standard set of building blocks that represents or that characterizes this particular tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, a standard set of organizational principles, or grammars or syntax, however you want to say it, that represent rules, tacit and explicit, for how those building blocks can be put together to shape composite wholes. And then finally, a variety of context, philosophical, spatial, temporal, social, aesthetic, etc., that shape and imbue and give dimensionality to these composites that you put together. So when you look at the history of the Dzogchen tradition and how the nature of the dark retreat has been constantly changing and fluctuating and being modified over time, if you understand these generative principles, you can begin to understand the logic of what's happening here, that people are drawing from a repertoire of set number of contemplative elements, postures, gestures, gazes, visualizations, etc., and they're putting them together in ways that have long-standing histories in Tibet, the syntax of meditation, the grammar of meditation, the organizational principles of meditation. And then they're being filled up by these contexts that any Tibetan worth their salt in these traditions understood very deeply in character, philosophical understandings, cosmological understandings, etc., etc. And so I'll wind that up by saying, or just proposing, we often talk about translation, we often talk about adaptation, we often talk about secularization when we're discussing how we might go from Theravada Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism or Sufi traditions or indigenous traditions and move them into very different kinds of contexts. And I would like to offer a different verb, and that verb would be to generate or be generative, that we understand the generative principles of a given tradition, and then instead of translating any particular practice, we apply those generative principles and create things from scratch, from the ground up. So that if you come to me and say, hey, I'm an elementary school teacher, or I'm a doctor dealing with people who have clinical signs of depression, or I'm trying to help young people suffering from overwhelming anxiety, then if I have an understanding of these generative principles, these first principles from any given tradition, then instead of taking a practice and adapting it, I could work with that person dynamically and try to very precisely customize something. And so for this reason, we've been working with design specialists and design thinking to consider what might a contemplative design process looks like, where we can go through a process of discovery. Who are they? What are they looking for? What are the issues and challenges and opportunities and realities in which they're embedded? And then we can use these generative principles as our design toolkit to work together with them to design something that's generative, that's designed from scratch, from the ground up, but is deeply influenced by these spiritual traditions, whether Tibetan Buddhism or something else that we're familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, my gosh, it's just so rich, incredibly, incredibly rich. Woo, boy, before I hand it over to Michael for comments and additions to it, this is really the essence of skillful means, upaya, right? Is just meeting people where they're at. I think, in my view, this is the crux of the translation, cultural translation issue and invitation. Is it's somewhat facile, easy to take cookie cutter practices. It's not in any way to dismiss their traditional application, efficacy, and their role. But boy, it takes a little bit more artistry. It takes a little bit more sensitivity, a little bit more deep listening to deconstruct these practices into their fundamental constituents, generate them in new languages, new lexicons, and all that are a kind of time for this day and age. And that's when these practices are really going to take off. They're really going to land. And I might even say, this is when we can say we make these traditions our own. Then they become really adapted in the best sense of that word, translated in the best sense of the word, and then they take root. Because it's just like you're saying, we are not Tibetan Buddhists. We're Americans studying a form of Buddhism known as Tibetan Buddhism, and we have to maintain sight of that. So Michael, I'm very curious if you have anything to add along what David was just saying, also this issue of preservation versus adaptation. And then tied into this, not to throw too much against the wall, but connected to this, I see also this issue of tying back in a little bit of the secrecy thing. Is it in fact appropriate to bring technologies of this type of power to scale, so to speak? Or should they in fact be kept restricted? Should they be held in this more protected milieu so that they can be more effectively kind of harnessed in the West? So if that takes us too far askance, I can come back to that in a second. But I thought what David was riffing on was just such centrality that maybe you just have a little bit more to say or add to what he was running with.
I think that we're at a moment here, not to be hyperbolic, but that we're at a point here where our sanity, if I may, hinges very much on how we shed maladaptive systems and retool ourselves with human technologies that will enhance our life and transform ourselves. And we are also at a moment where we have access to these extraordinary archive of the contemplative human heritage, where we have access to traditions, not the Tibetan alone by any means, but those are the traditions that we're talking about here and that we're most exposed to. And to think about adaptation and translation and more so generation as a kind of processes that that bring these tools, that bring these technologies, these human technologies of transformation into our lives to enhance greater attentional, greater emotional, greater imaginal, greater embodied ways of being in the world. If we're not doing that, then what are we doing? Frankly, that's what it's all about. And, David mentioned this generative contemplation initiative and this kind of thinking that is imbued with this contemplative design thinking. I think that it's very powerful. We're also setting up a lab here at the Contemplative Sciences Center called Circle, the collaborative lab about research and innovation for contemplation that's really looking at what works and what doesn't. In other words, let's put experimental condition. Let's create experimental conditions where we can test out what works and what doesn't. And what do we mean works? Well, let's look at all sorts of measures that have to do with biomeasures, but let's also look at first-person experience. And that's been profoundly neglected in a rigorous, articulate manner, a nuanced manner, in my estimation. And taking phenomenology very serious as a methodology, as a way of understanding human experience in conversation with objective measures that we gain from understanding biometrics, and really thinking about that as a kind of continuum of understanding contemplative experiences. I think, anyways, that's where my work lies these days. And if we can couple these kind of multiple dimensions together, such as David suggested, contemplative design thinking with experimentation and particularly rich phenomenological descriptive accounts of experiences and other ways of knowing what happens under certain conditions and certain populations practicing specific practices, then we can begin this process in a very informed manner of transforming maladaptive to adaptive tools of transformation.
And so, I mean, again, just so rich. Issues of scale. I mean, is it appropriate? I just want to come back to this. Is it appropriate in this kind of framework of adaptation to bring these types of practices to scale? Especially.
So let's dial in on that, because I'm sure we both have a lot to say. When you say these practices, so first of all, they're varied. We have 1,000 years plus history, as we've articulated, multiple traditions, and in the Dzogchen alone, they're quite varied. And in the Kalachakra, they've taken on a kind of particular stream of the living tradition, and that has had its own. Well, let's just call it. It has its own living knowledge, right? And I think that those, let's just call them, let's all bundle those as sort of Tibetan dark retreat practices, okay? Just for the sake of conversation. I think there's also just going into the dark, right? And let's not confuse the two, right? I think it's very important and to understand that you can go into a closet and put a towel under the door and turn off the light and sit there for several days, or go into a cave, or create some kind of, sealed environment that is healthy to live in and yet deprived of light in any sensory stimuli, visual sensory stimuli, for extended durations. And there is, in fact, a very interesting science around sensory deprivation. We have a pretty good sense of what happens to people when they go into the dark for extended periods of time. And there's been fascinating research on that. Since the Korean War, they started to put people in deprivation environments in the 1950s in the Korean War, sponsored by the CIA, the Blueprint Project, and so on and so forth. And there's a kind of history in the 60s and 70s, post-military intervention. And so the last, 75 or so years, people have been studying humans in sensory deprived environments for short periods and pretty extensive periods. And we have a good record now of what happens with people in the dark. And I want to just carve that out as something that's not exactly the same of what David and I are talking about when we talk about contemplative practices from the Tibetan historical traditions. Even though those themselves are very varied, I just want to draw a distinction, because I think that we can talk about similarities, and I think there are there's darkness, which is the continuum, and there's interesting, I think, continuities of the kinds of emergent and self-emergent experiences that arise, visions, etc. We can talk about visions and hallucinations. There's all sorts of contraindicative experiences that emerge in both conditions, and so on and so forth. And yet, one, they're different contexts, even though they're both in the dark.
Yeah, that's super important. I mean, in my languaging, Sutra versus Tantra dark retreat, and that just being exactly what you're saying, Michael, a little bit more the over-the-counter, which doesn't really dismiss it. It just contextualizes it versus the prescription strength. And so with that in mind, maybe...
Could I just...
Yeah, go ahead, David, please.
I want to address the issue of scaling, because it'll be pretty quick, but...
No, take your time. There's no rush.
So I wanted to offer a version of like the value proposition for contemplation. I mean, speaking kind of very broadly, that basically the value proposition is you have methods that you engage in, the postures, the gazes, the visualizations, the different attentional modalities, etc. And you combine those methods with experiences that are elicited, triggered, and unfold by virtue of the application of those methods. And then number 3, there's a kind of aesthetic factor, the way these are symbolized, the language, is the body inside, if you're doing subtle body meditations, is it fluid in character, or is it aerodynamic in character? Or what are the languages? I mean, are you doing something in a doctor's office that says, I want to help you with your need, here's a practice, versus you walk into a temple and someone says, I want to liberate you, And so the aesthetic factor, and then finally the context that we've been talking about. So you put the methods, the experiences, the aesthetics, and the context, and you have an outcome. And maybe that outcome is insight, maybe it's realization, maybe it's a fundamental transformation in your mode of being, maybe it's an improved physical element, which is all over Tibetan Buddhist contemplative literature. Maybe it's finding a lost yak, which is something I remember in Shapkar, this famous Tibetan saint, where he talked about some nomad came to him and said, I've lost my yak. And he did deity yoga, this super high-end contemplative practice, in order to find the guy's yak. So, the outcomes can be very varied.
That's awesome.
The outcomes are, that's your theory of change.
Yeah.
The theory of change is you put these methods together with these experiences and these aesthetics and these contexts, and you get that outcome.
Yeah.
But for us to understand that theory of change, to understand which ingredients are crucial, which are not crucial, we have to have a really full understanding of all those things.
That's right.
Michael was talking about phenomenology. If we don't use phenomenology to really unpack these experiences, we're shooting in the dark by just talking about the methods and not even understanding the crucial role some of these experiences might play. Now, with that in mind, I'm trying to address the issue of scale. We're doing practices all the time. What do we call it? Meditation, whatever we call it. We're constantly doing practices that undergo the exact same kind of theory of change. They combine these different things, methods, experiences, whatever, and we get outcomes. So whether we should do contemplation or not, from my mind, if we think about contemplation as being more intentional and more deliberate about the practices we engage in and the kinds of outcomes they have for who we are as a person, how we relate to the world, relate to others, relate to ourselves, I would say 100% we should, in the face of these pervasive crises that we are constantly inundated with today. If we don't find the trigger or the key to an internal transformation that allows us to foster the external transformations we're going to need to survive as a species, as in the world, we are doomed. Now, that said, I'm not going to say who this is because someone told me this and I don't know if they'd be comfortable with being quoted, but a very famous Tibetan Rinpoche in the contemporary American world evidently said, we Tibetans really need to understand that we are giving the West our most precious resources, our Buddhist teachings, our contemplative practices. And what do we get back? We get back a bunch of goddamn trinkets.
Yeah.
We get back bottles of Coke and, t-shirts. I indulge my penchant for cursing. And we need to stop it.
Yeah.
Like, we need more back. And so I'm really sensitive to that. I spent my entire adult life working on Tibetan issues that have nothing to do with Buddhism and nothing to do with the academy. Working with technology development, working with entrepreneurship support for Tibetans, working with elementary school teaching support in Tibet and so forth. And the reason I've done that is because I think it's deeply problematic for us to go into the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and say, we need this now, move over, and we're going to take it and run with it.
Wow.
It's what we've been doing to the world and indigenous people for centuries now, whether it's their plants or their knowledge or their land and so forth. It's extractive, and there's just no way around it. I don't care how much integrity we have, how much respect we have, it is extractive. And we have to figure out some way. I don't have a great solution for you, but we have to figure out some way to acknowledge that's happening and not simply do what everybody else says. We need it, so we're going to do it, regardless of what you say.
Yeah. David, high five. I want to just give you a hug here. It's just so spot on. And it's a really another consequence of the multivalent aspect of imperialism, right? It's just another way. It's a land grab, in this case, of spiritual, incredibly sacred, powerful, transformative psychospiritual methods being brought over here. And this is precisely the promise and the peril of what we're talking about, which I see is almost archetypally represented in the dark. On one level, my personal experience is like, actually, Ruby Gobert, Michael knows him, NBA superstar, right? Said he did Dark Retreat. He said his meditation times 1,000. This is just meditation concentrate. So I think that this particular engagement of Dark Retreat is almost pathognomonic. It's almost indicative of the pathology that's taking place at the level that you're talking about, because at some level it represents so much of the promise and the peril of this kind of translation. But let me ask you, before I invite Michael back in, instead of giving Coke and trinkets, what would that look like if it was actually cross-pollinating or whatever? If this kind of interstate traffic, if this fruition was in fact more fruitional, what would that look like? What would it be besides trinkets and Coca-Cola? What could it be from our side? It would be remunerative. It would be, appropriate.
Well, I think like everything in life, it will manifest different for different people in different contexts. But for myself, just to speak at the personal level, when I was 34 years old, I had been a professor at the University of Virginia for 3 years. And the only skills I had in life were reading Tibetan text and teaching American undergraduates. That was it. And I remember I went to Lhasa for a year sabbatical, and I was in Lhasa, and my daughter at that time was 5, and she was going through Tibetan elementary school, forgot all her English and just was speaking Tibetan and so forth. And I was thinking, like, why would I go back to the University of Virginia? Why would I go back to this elite school and so forth? Like, I spent most of my adult life after graduating from Notre Dame as an undergraduate with Tibetans. Almost all my teachers were Tibetans. My friends were Tibetans. The things I cared about in life were Tibetan. I mean, it had given me so much benefit in my life. And I thought, why would I want to go back to the University of Virginia just to teach these privileged undergraduates and, and have a nice life based upon my profiting off the knowledge of these people that I had such a deep, loving relationship with. And so what I came up with in my life was I need to do something helpful. And I had zero skills. They didn't need another person reading Tibetan texts. They didn't need someone to teach American undergraduates. And so I spent the next decades of my life trying to reinvent myself, change my personality, change my skill set so I could help them. And over those, just not help them like I know what's good for them, but to ask them, like, what do you need? And how could I mobilize my resources and my talents to help support your aspirations? And so that's how I got involved with developing software for Tibetans, doing entrepreneurship, incubation, social innovation programs for Tibetans, helping with publishing projects. We did women's issues awareness raising campaigns, really whatever those communities asked for, we did. And it wasn't just me, it was so many other people. But that's an example of like, it wasn't a tit for tat, oh, you give us meditation, we give you this, but rather we benefited from you. We want you to benefit from us.
Beautiful.
In whatever makes best sense for you. And so when we come to the issue of the contemplative work per se, I also think it's really crucial that we involve Tibetan lineage holders in the discussion.
Absolutely.
We don't just treat them as experts, but we also ask them, how could this help you and your communities, your monastic communities, your nunneries, your lay people? How could the benefit flow in both directions? Not just, oh, great, we have a great thing for elementary schools now, or for people in North America who want to meditate. How could it go in both directions?
Fantastic, David. And Michael, I'll chime in here, but let's bring this wonderful, very wide, elegant couchman in to bear along this particular practice. How can we implement this aspiration, the strategy, and take this practice, appropriately translate it into the West, and then and do so in a spirit where it in fact is mutually beneficial, where we can actually give back by paying homage and all the things that I want to extract from you guys in terms of how can we best hold this practice? Because as you know, it's getting out there, right? The reason I'm reaching out to you is this practice is taking off. Celebrities are talking about it. Superstar athletes are talking about it. The word is out. It really is this really maybe new meditative kid on the block. It's hard to say. I think potentially, just to dovetail into what you were saying briefly earlier, David, about finding the irreducible kind of aspects of this meta crisis. I can tell you from my own experience in engaging in the dark for decades, this is one reason I'm so passionate about it now, cautiously, is that it does take you down to the reduction base. I think you can make very strong phenomenological arguments and models for the meta crisis as being iterative of the type of distraction that is completely taken away from you in the dark. I argue that the meta crisis is distraction upon distraction upon distraction, fracture upon fracture upon fracture. And so when you go into such an intense healing, holding, non-distracted environment as a wrathful form of liberation, it almost brings about this type of healing, holding, and integration because of its capacity to just basically keep us from moving, right? So I wanted to throw that in the mix, but in order to make it really practical for our listeners, because a lot of people are going to be listening to this, that are going to be saying, geez, is this something for me? Should I be exploring this practice? What does it have to offer me? What are the potentialities? So if we could maybe just take it a little bit more into that direction, application in the modern age, doing it properly with integrity, whatever that might mean. I send that across the bow to see if Michael and then you, David, have something to say about that, because a lot of people are listening to this. Geez, does this have a place in the world? Does it have a place in my life? Why is it becoming so popular right now? So, Michael, I'm curious where in addition to what David, his rich set of comments, where some of this might land with you.
Thank you. Yes. So, again, when we're talking about the Tibetan practices, and just to reiterate, I think categorically I'll talk about them as twofold. One, these Tibetan practices within the traditions we've been talking about, Dzogchen and Kalachakra, and just going into the dark, things like, the Rudy Gobert sort of experience, right? And what happens. And so just on the Tibetan practices of dark retreat, these are integral to a contemplative curriculum that is manifold. They begin with extensive preparatory practices and a whole kind of cultivation of the self in a very particular world, imagined and constructed and relatable and extended in very, very particular ways that then morph and segue into practices of more extensive imaginal simulations of the self and sublime forms and incubatory worlds that then extend again in their own transformative gestures, and then are completed through these stages of rather rigorous somatic yogas and processes of deep integration of the self and psyche and the kind of affective embodied being in a world that's been transformed through perceptual cognitive processes very, very intentionally. And by the time then you go into the dark, right, which in the Kalachakra, just laying out this kind of program, is at two different stages. One is what's called the threefold isolations. And the isolations are the isolation of the body, the isolation of the voice, and the isolation of the mind. And the isolation of the body is stillness. That is to say, minimizing activity. And the isolation of the voice is silence and minimizing speech and sound more generally. And the isolations of the mind are minimizing the sensory stimuli, and in particular, the fluctuations of the mind. And these practices are very interested and, in fact, designed for, again, condition setting for mental activity to be monitored, modulated, and navigated for affect and sort of sensorial experiences to be, navigated and modulated in very particular ways. So as the mind wanders, and as the body becomes uncomfortable and discomforted, and as the sense of like yearning for to talk or to be expressive or to listen, etc., all of those are turned off in very intentional ways, right, through this sensory deprivation practice. And there's different techniques that are taught to the practitioner to navigate those kind of emergent experiences, because they are dramatically and intentionally antithetical to ordinary waking modes of being. Ordinary waking modes of being are deeply conditioned by the sensorium, the world of stimuli, of sights and sounds and smells and tastes. And the understanding is that we become so deeply entangled in that sensorial stimuli that our whole sensory motor apparatus, our whole sense of being in the world, the entanglement, the deep entanglement with the world in light while awake, with our full sense capacities lit up, is how we experience the world. It's how we interpret the world. It's how we make sense of the world. It's a sense-making process that we're constantly undergoing. So, to put one in the dark, again, very intentionally to isolate that activity, whether it be mental or vocal or somatic, bodily, is a very intentional process of cultivating self-awareness. And that's based on a kind of monitoring of stabilization and the wandering of the body and the mind and or a stilling and a wavering, right? And you're constantly oscillating across the spectrum of these two, stillness and wandering or wavering. And all of this, again, just talking about the Tibetan context, is also done in a very nurturing environment, right? The practice manuals say, as David mentioned earlier, the space is very articulate, and they're very careful about the kind of space. What kind of space is it? It's not moist, it's not cold, it's completely dark, there's no light, but it's also comfortable, right? And they're also interested in the manuals I've read of making sure that the person is comfortable in that environment. Make sure you have the clothes to keep you warm. Make sure that you have good food to eat. Make sure you have clean water to drink. Make sure that you're getting intermittent massages. These are actually part of the classical prescriptions because they know that these are intensely alternative scenarios for being human, these conditions. So, and then you're getting plenty of rest. You're sleeping for long durations. That's very important. So, again, deprivation, but it's not a kind of aestheticism that is being prescribed. I really want to make that point. It's about creature comforts, but understanding in order to have the conditions to maximally or optimally navigate emergent experiences, understanding that experiences that emerge of all multiple sensorium can be rather intense in that an extreme discomfort, whether it be physical or otherwise, isn't going to help the situation. So that's a really important point. I'll use that to segue into the sort of category B, which aren't the practices in the Tibetan context of these traditions we've been discussing, but just going into comfortable spaces deprived of light, okay? What now we're finding, as you alluded to, professional athletes and people under all sorts of spiritual seeking, people who are interested in healing themselves from their personal situations, and they're looking towards the darkness for a kind of healing modality. And darkness does provide a kind of healing modality for many. And yet it's multivalent in that it's not only healing. And let's unpack that a little bit. I think that there are some principles here that we can learn without getting into specifics. Neither David or I have spoken about specific practices. I really want to mention that. But we're talking in broad gestures and strokes about the kinds of, again, condition setting and emergence, the kind of navigating and monitoring experience that these kinds of practices are framed in within the tradition. I think that if we're interested in having contemporary practices of dark immersion, which we already do, and we are now making sense of them, that to make sense of them, to borrow explicitly the exact techniques of the Tibetan tradition, I think is, as we've already, talked about in this conversation, is just riddled with all sorts of issues that we all need to be very, very cognizant of. And I also think that there are ways that there are understandings that we can integrate because people, particularly those in the Tibetan traditions, but in other traditions too, have been going into the dark for personal enhancement of life and deep transformative experiences for a very long time. So what are some of the principles? What are some of the kind of core takeaways that we can extend into this newly emerging contemporary space of dark immersion? And so just to reiterate, I'll say it's about condition setting. One, it's about, a set and setting. We get the language from the psychedelic science. This very much applies. What are the conditions and how are they optimized? Two, that there are comfort levels because you are stripping yourself away of the cognitive, perceptual, sensorial comforts, the stimuli of ordinary life, that there are other comforts, that there's some food that keeps you healthy and you can appreciate it. There's clean water. You don't have to worry about that. There's no dangers there. There's nothing, these, warm clothes, etc., that you have the fundamental kind of comforts. It's critical. And these traditions say that. And then third, and I realize that this is where we could have a very long conversation, but I do think that having some degree of exposure to contemplative skills, contemplative life skills of navigating one's own experience, of monitoring emergent experience, of understanding the push and pull along the spectrum of effort and how cognitive effort shapes who we are, how there is a kind of concentration, relaxation, and reflexive knowing spectrum that we learn to navigate as contemplative practitioners, and having some exposure, if not, skill set and competency as you go into the dark, I think is very important, and to enhance the experience, even if it's a relatively short duration of let's say 2 to 4 days.
So
I'll pause there, but I could go on.
No, this is incredibly rich. A couple things. One is, how do you reconcile that with David's comment earlier about surprise and expectation? Because
Sure.
this to me is a delicate dance. Because on one level, the surprise aspect, just being open to whatever arises. I think that could be arguably the irreducible central instruction is just surrender. I mean, very similar to psychedelics, trust and surrender whatever emerges. So how do you reconcile that more kind of maybe absolute approach with some of what you just talked about? Because I agree. I think both of those are really needed. And I'm wrestling with this because I'm writing 2 books on this topic, right? And so on one level, by the mere fact that I'm writing these 2 books, am I in fact completely contraindicating or going against what David recommended is a central kind of ingredient of success, of just being open and being surprised?
Well, tell me how you see where's the rub? Because I understand you don't want to prepare for a surprise. There's kind of...
Well, again, if maybe David could chime in here as well. If I understood properly what David was saying, and I can relate to this from my own experience I mentioned earlier in my long retreat, is something about just the beginner's mind approach. Just go in there. Now I'm talking very specifically now about the 3-day, 4-day, 5-day thing. I'm obviously not at all talking about the traditional 4-day practice. So on one level, it's just the beginner's mind, go in, open, see what happens. On another level, this more maybe perhaps relative approach of the skill sets to how to negotiate the dark. Do you see that? How do you see those?
The emergent experience, the dark, not per se. Yeah. That's what I'm suggesting. Yeah.
Okay. So altogether, there's a carte blanche. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's what.
Just as what I'll call a contemplative life skill that can be applied across varied contexts. In this context of darkness, it becomes heightened. As David was saying, we're constantly having emergent experience, unpredictables, unpredictabilities, potentials. Unexpected experiences are constantly emerging, and yet to have skills that are refined in how to navigate them, how to monitor them, how to, with self-awareness, respond appropriately, is a very particular contemplative skill set. And in the dark, when the distractions are taken away, when the sense stimuli distractors are no longer they're no longer able to turn our attention to different stimuli in order to distract ourselves, then that kind of unpredictability heightens. And it's very important, I would argue, and it's a conversation, I'm interested to hear other perspectives, but I would argue that unpredictability is there regardless, and heightened without the sensory stimuli, and that having some fundamental familiarization, not to be an adept per se, but have some degree of monitoring, of a sense of meta-awareness, what we call meta-awareness, the capacity to monitor the contents of your experiential consciousness will serve you well in that context.
That's spot on. That's exactly what I was looking for. So here's the wonderful challenge. This conversation is so rich. There are so many different directions we could take this to. I can talk to you guys all afternoon very easily, but I want to be very respectful of your time. And so what I want to maybe suggest something that we reconvene for chapter 2 in this, where we take some of these really wonderful, rich, elegant strands, and instead of trying to just jam everything in to 1 hour and a half, 2 hour session, that we actually take a little bit more leisurely pace and unpack some of these, because there's so much richness here. And I think for a lot of listeners, this is a real treasure trove of overarching view, right view of how to really relate to this extraordinary practice, which is, again, gaining some amazing traction in the West. And so if that resonates with you, this is what I would perhaps like to wrap up for a closing question for today, and then we can revisit some of these other things later, because again, I want to really respect your time, is someone advice on one level. We're circumambulating this, but maybe throw a dart at it very specifically. What might be your advice for someone who is really interested in this? We're broad brushstrokes around this, but very specifically, someone comes to you and says, I listened to your podcast. This is like really interesting stuff. Talk to me. Now, we've been doing that for an hour and a half, but maybe specifically about people wanting to go in.
Well, what I would say about that is that in terms of the Tibetan practices, there's really two crucial issues despite all the diversity. The main outcome of these practices is basically recognition. And so if we're talking about the self-presencing of awareness, that's in some sense the method of the practice. Like, you need that content to happen. The extent to which you're having these self-emergent visions, their intensity, their duration, their dynamism, like, that's crucial to the practice unfolding. But the outcome that you want is, in the face of that unfolding, you want to be able to self-recognize it. You want to be able to recognize those visions as a manifestation of your own awareness. And so those two principles, both that you need the unfolding of the self-presencing of your own experience, but then within that unfolding, you actually need to self-recognize it. That's the real outcome in question. And everything else is just methods, which you may or may not do in any given tradition. So with that in mind, you talked about these celebrities. And at one point, you sent us some questions early on, and you had said something like, what do you think of these celebrities? And, really my perspective is, I don't know any of these guys. I mean, some of them seem like idiots. Some of them seem like really sensitive, thoughtful people. So it's really just like with everything else in life. If this is meaningful for them, and in the context of people who know them well, they see positive manifestations in their life, I think it's great what they're doing. If, on the other hand, people who know them well see this as feeding into a kind of egotism, narcissism, etc., then,
That's great. Yeah.
pretty critical of it. But in terms of thinking about, like, someone coming to me and saying, what can I do, knowing that, I'm not the world's defining teacher of dark retreats or anything, what I would suggest is to find a kind of good balance between these two dichotomies. On the one hand, as you've talked about, it's important to be cautious, it's important to be careful, it's important to be respectful of these traditions, to have modesty and to have humility as you go into these practices. But at the same time, I would really encourage people to be playful, and be experimental, to explore, and to respect your own self and your own experience. Not to feel like you have to do what someone else told you has to do. Your experiences have to accord with that, but respect yourself, respect your experiences as they unfold. And with that in mind, if you're going to go into the darkness, then think about that little theory of change for yourself. First of all, what is your purpose? What do you hope for? Because it can just wildly vary. Maybe I'm just overstressed and I'm looking for some kind of calm in my life, or I'm bored and depressed and looking for some kind of spark or inspiration, or, I just suffered a catastrophic breakup and I really need just a different direction in my life. Just think about, what is your purpose? Have clarity of purpose. Even if it turns out you may find other purposes along the way, be a little bit intentional about why you're going into the darkness. And if it's just I want to be playful, that's fine too. It's a purpose. And once you have that purpose, then think about, where are you right now? What's the context of your life? Where are you? Because that's really important as you begin to have these experiences unfold in the darkness, to have clarity on where you are. Are you hurt? Are you stable? Are you volatile? Are you, thriving? Like where are you in your life right now in this context? So you can be sensitive to what these experiences mean. And then number 3, to think about, what methods do I want to deploy? Do I want to just sit in the darkness? Do I want to do a little Ashtanga yoga? Do I want to do a little calming meditation? What exactly do I want to do in the darkness?
Yeah.
And think about what are the methods I want to kind of play around with a little bit and experiment with and see how they work for me. And then finally, monitor your experience. Watch your experience. Note it. Not just like, oh, I saw this really cool, a self-emergent kind of arm that suddenly appeared, or a head of a Buddha or whatever. Watch your other experiences. How does your body feel? What random memories are floating up to the top of your mind? What's happening in your mind? What's the emotional tenor of your life? So watch all of these things in the context of the darkness retreat, so you can begin to note and consider how they come together. And with that in mind, I think the last thing I would say is, one of the interesting issues of dark retreats in Tibet and elsewhere in modern times and historical times is, what's the significance of the content that manifests in the dark retreat? Because there's two very different perspectives to take. Well, let's say three. One would be, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you see.
Right.
Like, what matters is that it happens, and how you respond to it in terms of this recognition of self. The actual content, it doesn't matter. It's from your childhood. It's from some exotic, faraway alien world. It doesn't really matter what it is. It doesn't matter at all. The second perspective would be, yeah, it doesn't really matter, but it matters in terms of helping you unfold your meditative practice. Like, certain kinds of visions might be indicators of problems. Some types of visions might be indications that, hey, you're really progressing along the practice. You just hit an important milestone, et cetera, et cetera. So that the actual content of what you're seeing in terms of your personal associations, it doesn't really matter, but it does matter in terms of telling you how you're doing in this practice and what methods you might want to bring to bear to help you get through what you might not realize are kind of stagnant places and so forth. So if you see too much blue, maybe you should look this way. If you're seeing a lot of geometric patterns, maybe you should adjust your breathing pattern, because those can all just get you stagnant. But the third thing is understanding that content as deeply personal in character and essential for you to understand and to interpret. And that's a totally different perspective. And the same thing goes with our other shared passion around dreams. Are the dreams simply a kind of content for us to recognize that they're this paradigmatic experience of illusion that we can bring into our lives? Or do the dreams actually matter? Does the content of the dreams matter? Do they speak to specific aspirations and sufferings and hopes and fears and trauma and unconscious content in our mind that could be transformative if we unpack it? The same dynamic happens in the darkness. And so you got to be clear, what are you going to do about that? Are you really interested in that personal detail of the vision? Or are you going to take this other perspective of being focused on the process and less on the personal associations?
Yeah, David, high five. This is another reason, as you know, I'm deeply passionate about the topic of dream yoga. In fact, in my schema of my languaging of the 5 nocturnal meditations, Parva yoga, which in this case would be dark retreat, transcends but includes both sleep yoga and dream yoga. And so your introduction of that narrative into this is one of the major reasons I've been doing this practice. And it's an unbelievable environment where, by kind of overthrowing the supremacy of the wake-centric state, this revolution empowers these 2 other states that are generally just almost categorically dismissed. And to me, one of the great gifts of being in extended darkness is it brings to life the dream arena. It just goes ballistic, and the capacity for lucidity in the deep real estate becomes extraordinarily heightened. So I'm very grateful for you to throw that into the mix. A topic we can return to when we come back, because really, what are we doing here, right? I mean, it's a little bit like the irreducible view of this practice is fundamentally, like you were talking about earlier, we're always working with our mind. It's this notion of experience. In a certain very real sense, we're always practicing. We're always working with our mind because that's all there is. And so whether it's the distilled environment of the dream arena, whether it's perhaps even a more distilled environment of the dark retreat arena, I think if we kind of bring to memory, to mind, that this is the fundamental approach, just like what Stephen LeBert said about dreams totally applies to this when he says waking consciousness is dreaming consciousness with sensory constraint. Dreaming consciousness is waking consciousness without sensory constraint. But the underlying unifying narrative is, in fact, mind consciousness. So again, just very, very spot on statements. And so, Michael, advice to someone who's interested in this, and then we'll come back and revisit everything in more depth a little bit later. So, Rich.
Yeah. So on the experiences there that David just gave a nod to, that is very rich, and we haven't talked about the actual experiences that emerge, which is, the parallels of visions and dreams of daytime or waking and sleeping, and how they are navigated as a continuum, what are called endogenous experiences, or what we're calling in this context self-emergent, coming from the mind itself as opposed from exogenous, that is to say, external stimuli oriented and sort of referential driven, is a deep theme throughout the Tibetan Vajrayana traditions, right? And to talk about darkness and the kinds of emergent experiences, and to talk about dream and the kind of emergent experiences of lucid dreaming, again, just to sort of emphasize and amplify what you both said, tremendous kind of continuums there that would be great to explore. If someone that was to come up to me and say they were interested in going into the dark for a retreat, I would say three things, and there's certainly overlap with what David mentioned. One, check your sincerity. Are you deeply sincere about doing this? And only you can tell. No one's going to tell you, not your wife, not your kid, not your friend, no one except for yourself. Are you sincere? And it's sincere about a kind of darkness mirror, if you will, right? Are you sincere about being with yourself? And what are the motivations for that? Which leads to the second. If the first is sincerity, the second is self-awareness. And David touched on it, but in my own language, work with your mind and your body and your comfort levels to understand the degree of sincerity and the degree of why you would want to go into the dark, and try to gauge through a kind of self-awareness processing how ready you are.
Yeah.
And for that, I would also extend to your social circles and not just rely on yourself. The sincerity, I think you need to check yourself, but the self-awareness, I would actually extend to your close social circles, if it makes sense. Talk to the people who care about you. And then third, give yourself glimpses that we go into the dark every night. At least I do. I fall asleep, right?
It's a miniature dark retreat. Totally.
So there are these. I'm not gonna, advertise any commercial products, but you can find blindfolds very easily. In the Tibetan world, we call these mun chung, which literally means the little darkeners. And they use them, and we haven't talked actually much about the context, but in Tibetan dark retreat was done, and I maybe people often think that you do it by yourself, because we talked about caves and huts, but there's also group dark retreat practices, especially in the Kalachakra, where you do it with communities, right? You do it with your practice community, and you go into darkness. And there are times when light comes in and everyone puts on you actually go through a process of making your own through fabrics, and you put on a blindfold, a munchung, a little darkener, and put them on for, start at whatever duration feels comfortable, and work up, and put that on for short durations regularly when you have time throughout the day while you're awake, and get a sense of being awake in the dark.
Yeah.
We typically know darkness by closing our eyes, and falling asleep is typically what follows. And even if we can't sleep, we keep our eyes shut. This is different because your eyes are open and you cannot see. It's a different experience. So get used to that. Do little experimentations by putting on blindfolds, going into a dark room, whether it be a bathroom or closet, just for 12 minutes, 24 minutes, 36 minutes, etc., whatever feels comfortable. And again, in a comfortable space, not a hard, cold, discomfort space, in a comfortable space, but without sensory stimuli. So just to conclude here, I'd say check your sincerity. gauge your self-awareness, and give yourself glimpses.
Fantastic, you guys. Wow. To be continued. It's extraordinarily rich. I mean, here's some ideas for next time, and we can ping behind the scenes. We're hinting at it, but the more articulate levels of preparation, how to work with integration, the role of science. What is science? Does science have a place in this? The role of a guide when you're in retreat for like at a certain point threshold, at what point do you actually need a guide? Because traditionally you have access to one. Dark retreat is the ultimate preparation for death. So there's so many directions we can take this. And then I think because this has been so concentrated, so rich, like dark retreat itself, maybe we can let our listeners digest, metabolize, incorporate what we've done here. We can come back, revisit, unpack some of these things, because this is actually kind of indicative of the potential, the pregnancy of this practice altogether. What we're doing here to me is actually indicative of this potential. So much here, so rich, such a technology, so to speak, bringing the ancient to the modern, bringing the East to the West, and doing so it all in the spirit of bringing benefit to this world. You know, I mean, I like to think of this potentially as the irony of using dark practice as an antidote to the dark age, and looking at things, another topic for next time, the extraordinary role of light pollution. I mean, the Kali Yuga, the dark age, to me, took on traction with Thomas Edison and how that light pulls us out in a way. So this is just fantastic, you guys. Thank you so much for your time. I can't wait to circle back around and do this again. And if you can hang around for just a second after we close off, we can touch base. But big bow of gratitude, and let's do it again.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I have so much respect for everything that you've done, and it's really great to have a chance. Michael and I talk all the time, but it's always wonderful to talk with you and illuminating. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, and I feel the same way. It's I just had the deepest opportunity to hang with two of the brightest minds in the business, so it just means the world to me. Ciao, ciao.
Deep breaths. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us, and thanks especially to David and Michael for sharing their wisdom with us. We hope you're enjoying the Edge of Mind podcast as much as we enjoy making it. Please spread the word, rate the podcast, review it, and subscribe to it if you haven't already. It's one way to invite more people into this community and into conversations in the fields of science, philosophy, psychology, spirituality, and the arts.